Do White Lives Matter is a headline taken from this article from The Liberal, dated June the 14th, 2020, in response to the recent killing of George Floyd. As we know, George Floyd was being detained by a police officer who had been called to the scene of a crime, and George died whilst under the knee hold of the officer. But George was not the first man to have been killed by a police officer in this way. In 2016, a man named Tony Timper, who was 32 years old and living with schizophrenia, phoned the police for help as he had not taken his medication and was feeling scared. Instead of receiving the help and assistance he needed, he ended up being killed under the same restraint that killed George Floyd. As you can see from this article, he pleaded for help more than 30 times as he repeatedly wailed, "You're going to kill me." The article reads, after Timper fell unconscious, the officers who had him in handcuffs assumed he was asleep and didn't confirm that he was breathing or feel for a pulse. It says, the officers laughed and joked as he lay there, and after seeing the disturbing video footage myself, you can hear them mocking him as he lay there. Tony was under the knee hold of the officer for roughly 14 minutes, and after 11 minutes he stopped moving and fell silent, but still the officer stayed on him for another 3 minutes. It wasn't until the paramedics arrived that Tony was reported dead at the scene. Unlike the case of George Floyd, all 3 police officers involved were released without charge. Even though the restraint used with both Tony and George were identical, George Floyd's death is being treated as a racial homicide, even though the multiple factors surrounding George were not taken into consideration. The fact that he had an underlying heart condition, or the fact that he was intoxicated with drugs, and he also tested positive for COVID-19. So why did the death of Tony Timper go unnoticed? And why were there no protests against police brutality for his death? Why were there no mass protests or riots or movements stating that white lives matter? As it happens, the UK has seen a recent protest for White Lives Matter, which occurred on the 23rd of June of this year. It's the infamous White Lives Matter Burnley banner that flew above the Etihad Stadium whilst the team were on their knees taking a knee for George Floyd, who was a career criminal. Instead of this lone act of peaceful protest being welcomed and allowed, it has been met with severe condemnation and disgust. So much so that the Burnley CEO made a statement saying how ashamed and embarrassed Burnley were, and the Claret skipper, Ben Mee, told BBC Radio 5 Live that fans like that don't deserve to be around football. The non-violent act not only cost the man behind the banner, Jake Heppel, to lose his job, but his girlfriend was also sacked. The 24-year-old insisted to the Mail Online that I'm not a racist. But why would anyone think he was? The banner didn't say White Lives Matter more. It read White Lives Matter Burnley. So why would a statement like this be deemed as racist? Especially when it seems perfectly okay to state that white lives don't matter, as was recently reported. Whilst Jake and his girlfriend have been sacked from their jobs, a Cambridge academic has just been promoted for her recent response saying that white lives don't matter, and she goes on to say, abolish whiteness. Dr. Gopal of Cambridge University said that her tweets were opposing the concept of whiteness, the societal structure that presumes the superiority of white people, and not attacking white people. But it's not the first time anybody has spoken out about the problem of whiteness, as stated in this Guardian article here. I explore the, quote, problem of whiteness in a previous video. So with it being a punishable offence to state that white lives matter, and whilst Cambridge lecturers are being rewarded to say that white lives don't matter, let's move on to the current worldwide movement of Black Lives Matter. I will be taking an in-depth look into the Black Lives Matter movement in a separate video, but for now let's just take a quick look at what the Black Lives Matter Wikipedia page says. Black Lives Matter, BLM, is an organised movement advocating for non-violent civil disobedience in protest against incidents of police brutality against African American people. And there at the end of the article it says that the broader movement and its related organisations typically advocate against police violence towards black people, as well as for various other policy changes considered to be related to black liberation. I did touch on the issue of police brutality in my previous video, and I will also be taking an in-depth look into this particular area in a separate video, so please stay tuned for that. So with police brutality being one of the main reasons behind the BLM movement, according to this Wikipedia page, let's just take a brief look at this chart entitled Number of People Shot to Death by the Police in the United States from 2017 to 2020 by Race. And looking at this chart, the number of white people shot dead compared to the number of black people shot dead is close to double each year over this 3.5-year period. Another thing prevalent behind the BLM movement is the non-violent protests. But they haven't been non-violent protests. Here's a man supporting the BLM movement in America that have just blocked the road and the crowd are attacking the cars and the people inside. Here's a CCTV still image of a man being attacked in a supermarket because he was accused of saying the N-word. It turned out that the man was a member of staff, and thankfully, Macy's defended the man as there was no evidence of him actually having said the N-word. The next slide is a disturbing image, so please feel free to look away. These images show the level of protest in Seattle, where a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old were amongst the wounded in this shooting. The article goes on to say that the 16-year-old later died, but the 14-year-old remains in a critical condition. Here's a still image from a video taken from the riots in France, where the rioters were heavily armed and were attacking other BLM rioters. Here's a still image from the riots that were taking place in Brixton, London, where many police officers were also injured. According to this article by The Telegraph, 22 officers were injured. The incident was reported to be a street party and the rioters were called revellers. This next image shows a white male being stabbed in the neck by a black male during another BLM protest. Sadly, this man was not the only person to have been stabbed as part of the BLM protests. 3 men were stabbed to death and another 8 people were injured in the aftermath of a BLM protest in Reading of June this year. The victims were all part of Reading's LGBT community and had attended the protest in support of BLM. The man responsible for the killings is a Libyan refugee who was already known to MI5, as he had committed numerous offences including stabbings between 2015 and 2019. This next article shows that a man was shot to death by the police after a stabbing in a Glasgow hotel, which is currently housing asylum seekers. 6 people were being treated for their injuries, including a 42-year-old police officer. The man who was shot dead was a 28-year-old Sudanese asylum seeker who is thought to have arrived in the UK 6 months ago via France, also after fleeing persecution in Sudan. 2 newspapers from France, the Midi Libre and Le Parisien, failed to identify the suspect correctly, and both articles described him as un homme blanc, a white man. So to bring this to a close, let's take a look at the article from the House of Commons Library for knife crimes statistics in the UK. Looking at the green bars at the top of the page, we can see that knife crime have increased yearly since 2014 and 2015, and this number has nearly doubled in 5 years. In fact, according to this chart taken from Statista in 2018, London's murder rate has now overtaken that of New York's. How and why has London overtaken New York for its murder rates? Is anybody looking into the increase of these murders, to what the reasons might be, and what's being done about it? Talking about it and asking questions is a great first step, So let's keep asking questions and let's get London safe again. Thank you for watching. Please stay tuned for my next video.